My name is Courtney Hale, and the night everything exploded still plays in my head like a stuck recording. You've ruined our lives! My sister screamed from across the living room, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. My mom didn't hesitate. She jumped right in, throwing the same words at me like they'd been waiting on her tongue for years. And the worst part? I didn't even fight back. I'd heard versions of that sentence my entire life, but that night, something in me finally stopped trying. My dad stood there watching, arms crossed, not saying a word, but the look he gave me said everything. This is your fault too. It was the same look he'd used every time anything went wrong in our home. Money problems, arguments, Amber messing up again. Somehow it always circled back to me. So instead of begging or defending myself, I walked to my room, grabbed the small duffel bag I kept under my bed, and zipped it shut. No dramatic speech, no tears. Just done. I stepped out of that apartment and didn't look back. No one followed me. No one even asked where I was going. And the next morning, sitting alone with a cheap cup of coffee and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I glanced at my phone. 8:30 a.m. 14 missed calls. All from the same people who told me the night before that their lives would be better without me. I hadn't picked up. Not yet. Because I already knew those calls weren't apologies. They were something else. Something worse. Before I tell you what happened when I finally picked up those calls, tell me, what time is it for you right now and where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story reaches. Long before my life split apart, I had already learned that harmony in our home never depended on the truth, but on keeping certain people comfortable. Growing up on the outskirts of Chicago meant noise came from every direction. The thin apartment walls, the constant hum of traffic, the echo of neighbors arguing, but none of it compared to the noise inside our own living room. That was where the real tension lived. The kind that settled in your chest and taught you to breathe quietly so you wouldn't draw the wrong kind of attention. My dad carried stress like it was stitched into his spine. Every shift at his delivery job wore him down, and every inconvenience found a place to land once he stepped through the door. I figured out early that his anger didn't need a reason, it only needed motion. A late bill, a broken appliance, a complaint from a manager, anything could set him off. And whenever he got that look, the one where he seemed to be collecting blame before deciding where to drop it, I knew where it was going to land. Somehow, it always made sense to him that I was responsible for problems I had no part in. My mom never exploded the way he did. Her version of disappointment was quieter, but it lasted longer. She had a way of agreeing with whatever he believed, if it meant ending an argument sooner. Over time, that habit became a pattern, and the pattern became a rule. If something went wrong, it was safer to point a finger at me than confront the actual issue. She told herself she was protecting the family, but the reality was simpler. She was avoiding conflict, even if it meant placing the weight on my shoulders. Then there was my sister. From the moment she learned how to talk her way out of trouble, everyone treated her like she was made of glass. Amber didn't have to earn her place in the family hierarchy. She just existed in it, shining even when she hadn't done anything worth applauding. Teachers excused her. Relatives adored her, neighbors complimented her, and my parents believed every word she said no matter how outrageous it sounded. She could fail a class, lose a job, or forget an important deadline, and the story always turned into a tale about how she had been distracted or overwhelmed. And I was always woven somewhere into that reasoning, even when I wasn't there. The favoritism wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like the quiet shift of a scale that never tilted my way. When groceries were short, Amber's favorite snacks stayed in the cart while mine disappeared. When money was tight, my school activities were the first to be cut. When both of us needed help with something, my requests were treated like unnecessary noise. I learned not to ask. I became the responsible one by default. The child who didn't argue, who didn't take up space. who didn't need anything. I cleaned, studied, and stayed out of the way because it felt like the only method of survival. The more I did, the more silent expectations grew around me. No one said it out loud, but I was the one meant to absorb pressure so Amber could float through life untouched. What I didn't realize back then was how deeply those roles had carved themselves into us. Every year added another layer, another moment that settled into my memory as proof that I was meant to carry the weight of the family, while Amber carried none of it. I grew up believing that balance wasn't something I deserved. It was something I ruined simply by existing. And when you learn that lesson young, it clings to you long after you've stepped outside the walls where it started. There comes a point when the rhythm of a household shifts just enough that you can sense something irreversible building beneath the surface, even before it reveals its final shape. That shift happened quietly, long before anyone realized what it meant, and by the time it showed itself, the damage was already done. Amber's internship had been the center of my parents' hope for months. They had spoken about it as if it were a guaranteed escape route for the family, a chance for her to finally become something after years of drifting. Even though she treated the opportunity casually, the pressure surrounding it grew thicker every week. I stayed out of the way the best I could, pretending I didn't notice the tension collecting around every conversation. Still, I could feel a strange tightness forming in the apartment, as if everyone had silently agreed that success was owed to her and that failure, if it came, would need a place to land. When the rejection arrived, it was like a quiet collapse. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden crash, just a gradual unraveling that spread from room to room. I recognized a certain look in her eyes, the one she wore whenever she knew consequences were too close. It was the same look I had seen countless times growing up, always followed by the same routine, an explanation crafted around everything except her own actions, a story where she was overwhelmed, misunderstood, or dragged down by circumstances she claimed she could not control. And I knew, without anyone saying a word, that the narrative was already shifting toward me again. The atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier by the hour. There was a weight pressing down that didn't belong to me, but somehow always ended up resting on my shoulders. I could sense the unspoken expectations circling me, the familiar assumption that I would absorb the emotional fallout like I had done for years. Every sound seemed sharper, every breath quicker, as if the air itself was turning against me. That familiar tightness in my chest resurfaced, the one that always came when the invisible spotlight returned to its usual place. I stood in my room that evening, staring at the worn edges of the furniture I had lived with since childhood. Every corner carried a memory of being pushed aside, silenced, or blamed, and I could feel each one rising again, layering over the present moment. There was something deeply exhausting about realizing that no matter how carefully I tried to exist, I would always be assigned a role I never agreed to play. As the energy in the apartment swelled, my thoughts drifted to every moment I had tried to earn peace, every chore finished early, every achievement brushed aside, every sacrifice made quietly so the household could stay balanced. None of it had ever changed the script. I understood then that nothing I did would ever change it. The walls of that apartment held the same pattern for so long that it became impossible to breathe inside it. While the night deepened, a strange clarity settled in. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was a feeling so calm it almost scared me. I realized I had reached the end of what I could carry. The tension in the air wasn't something I could soften anymore, and the role I had been forced into was not one I could continue to accept. All the years of being the one who adjusted, the one who stayed quiet, the one who tried to keep peace, it all led to a single understanding. The only way to protect myself was to remove myself. I packed my bag without hesitating. I didn't plan, hesitate, or wonder what anyone would think. For the first time, I didn't care. The apartment that had shaped so much of my silence no longer felt like a place I belonged. I walked out the door knowing that leaving wasn't an act of defiance. It was survival. The first night away felt strangely quiet, as if the world had muted itself just long enough for me to understand what solitude actually sounded like. The cheap motel room I found wasn't meant for comfort, only shelter. But even its thin walls felt safer than the apartment I had left behind. For the first time in years, nothing demanded my reaction. I didn't have to brace for footsteps or measure the weight of someone else's disappointment before it reached me. The silence was unfamiliar, yet I sensed it was something I would have to grow into. The next morning came before I was ready. I stared at the faded curtains and felt the exhaustion settle deeper into my bones. Leaving meant freedom, but freedom didn't erase reality. I had no long-term plan, no savings beyond a small amount I had scraped together working part-time. That money was meant for emergencies I never defined, but now it was the only thing keeping my situation from collapsing completely. Survival wasn't a concept anymore. It was a schedule I had to build hour by hour. I walked to a small cafe nearby, choosing the cheapest drink on the menu just to have a place to sit. I knew I needed a strategy, something practical, something that didn't depend on anyone but me. My mind drifted back to the one skill I trusted: studying. I had spent years helping classmates understand material they found impossible. Teaching had always come naturally, maybe because I understood what it felt like to struggle without support. It was ironic that something I did to escape chaos could become the thing that helped me move forward. I used the cafe's Wi-Fi to search for tutoring opportunities. Most listings required experience I couldn't prove, but a few online platforms allowed beginners with lower rates. I filled out profile after profile, typing out explanations of what I could offer. The process felt slow and uncertain, but it was the only path available. While others in the cafe chatted casually about their day, I sat there mapping out a foundation I hoped wouldn't crumble beneath me. When the first student request arrived, a sense of cautious relief washed over me. It wasn't much, just a single session, but it was proof that I wasn't entirely invisible. I took the session from the motel room, aware of how temporary the setup looked. The shaky desk, the old lamp, the unreliable Wi-Fi. It all contrasted sharply with the calm tone I tried to project. Even so, teaching that hour reminded me of something I had forgotten. Competence could exist even in unstable places. Days blurred together as I worked through whatever small tasks I could find. I rationed food carefully, counted every dollar spent, and adjusted my expectations more than once. There were moments when doubt pressed heavily against my resolve. Moments when I wondered if I had stepped into a future too unpredictable to manage. Yet each time that fear rose, a quieter certainty answered it. Staying would have broken me faster. Eventually, I found a shared room for rent in a run-down house a few blocks from the motel. It wasn't ideal, but the rate was low enough to stretch my limited income. The space was cramped and worn, with mismatched furniture and creaky floors, but it gave me a base to build from. I spent long evenings organizing lessons, rewriting study materials, and practicing methods that might appeal to more students. The work took every ounce of energy I had, but it also created something I had never experienced: a sense of direction that belonged solely to me. Living independently forced me to confront every weakness I tried to hide and every strength I didn't realize I possessed. There were no shortcuts, no reassurances, no safety nets, yet each small victory proved that progress didn't require approval from the people who once controlled every corner of my life. The distance between me and that apartment grew wider each day, and with it, the weight that had defined my childhood finally began to loosen. There's a certain clarity that arrives only after survival stops being the primary concern. It doesn't happen all at once. It seeps in slowly until the small victories begin to feel like momentum rather than coincidence. That shift came to me during one of those long evenings spent organizing lesson plans at the small desk in the rented room. Somewhere between adjusting schedules and rewriting practice tests, I realized I no longer felt like I was piecing my life together in panic. For the first time in a long while, I was building something with purpose. As weeks turned into months, tutoring evolved from scattered sessions into a steady rhythm. Students began returning, not because my rates were low, but because my methods worked. Word spread through parents, classmates, and online forums, and my inbox filled with requests that once felt impossible to imagine. Each new student reminded me how far I had come from those fragile days in the motel. I still lived modestly, but stability no longer felt like a distant concept. I had carved out a corner of independence that no one could take credit for or undermine. The more I worked, the more I understood the limitations of trading time for income. There was a ceiling I would eventually hit, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life chasing hours. The idea of creating something bigger began as a quiet thought, one I pushed aside until it returned again with more force. I had spent years developing techniques, exercises, and explanations that helped my students grasp difficult subjects. It felt natural to consider turning that knowledge into something accessible beyond one-on-one sessions. I studied digital platforms late into the night, learning how others packaged their expertise. I took notes on course structures, teaching styles, and the small details that made certain programs effective. The process was overwhelming at first, yet strangely energizing. I knew the path wouldn't be simple, but complexity had never scared me. What terrified me was the idea of living a life where I still felt trapped by circumstances I couldn't control. Creating something of my own wasn't just ambition, it was an escape from every limitation I had grown up with. Building the course consumed every spare moment. I recorded lessons, edited slides, created practice materials, and even taught myself how to structure online modules. Each task forced me to sharpen skills I didn't know I had. I didn't have expensive equipment or a team to assist me. I worked with the tools I could afford, doing everything from voiceovers to formatting on my own. The process was exhausting, but there was a kind of pride hidden in the exhaustion. Every late-night struggle felt like proof that I wasn't waiting for permission to shape my future. When the course finally launched, I tried not to expect anything. I reminded myself it was just the first step, that success wasn't guaranteed. The first sale came a day later, a single notification that felt disproportionately significant. It wasn't the number that mattered, it was the validation. Someone believed in what I created. That belief multiplied faster than I could process. Within weeks, the sales grew from occasional to frequent. Students posted reviews, shared their progress, and recommended the course to others. The momentum that followed didn't feel real at first. It felt like standing in the doorway of a life I wasn't entirely sure I deserved. As enrollment increased, so did my income. The numbers were still modest compared to established creators, but they were life-changing for someone who once rationed food and worried about every purchase. I upgraded my workspace, then later moved into a small studio apartment of my own. It wasn't luxurious, but it symbolized a version of independence I had never imagined while living under my parents' roof. Success didn't erase the past, but it made the weight of it easier to carry. Each step forward reinforced the truth that I had built this life through effort no one had witnessed, supported, or encouraged. And with every milestone, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming widened, creating a future shaped entirely by my own choices. There comes a moment in every quiet stretch of progress when the past tries to press its way back in, uninvited and persistent, as if it cannot accept that it no longer has control. That moment arrived for me early one morning, long before the sun had fully risen, when my phone lit up with notifications I hadn't expected to see again. The names on the screen were ones I had trained myself not to think about, yet there they were, stacked one after another, like a reminder of a life I no longer claimed. At first, I just stared at the glowing numbers, unsure whether to feel confusion or irritation. My days had become predictable in the best way: focused work, gradual growth, and a steady calm that had taken so long to build. Seeing their names break through that calm felt like an old wound reopening itself without warning. The calls came in bursts, one after another, from numbers I had memorized long ago but never saved. I didn't answer any of them. Something inside me tightened at the thought of hearing voices that had only ever reached me in moments of accusation or need. As the calls continued, I found myself thinking about how unlikely it was for them to reach out without reason. My parents had always moved through life believing everything would arrange itself around their expectations. For them to contact me now meant something in their world had shifted in a way they could no longer manage. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought a strange heaviness. The distance I had built allowed me to see them not as authority figures, but as people shaped by their own patterns, patterns that had failed them long before they ever failed me. When the messages started arriving, I could sense the desperation between the lines even without reading them in detail. Each preview displayed fragmented pleas, half-formed phrases, or long stretches of text that hinted at panic. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. The tone was familiar enough that I could guess the shape of their words: trouble, crisis, expectation. The family dynamic had always operated on a predictable cycle. Someone faltered, blame was misplaced, and responsibility landed on whoever seemed easiest to burden. That role had once belonged to me. It no longer did. Throughout the day, I moved through my routine with a quiet disorientation. It wasn't that I felt pulled toward them. It was the strange weight of being remembered only when convenient. I had lived entire years in that house without being considered unless someone needed a target or a solution. Now, after building a life they knew nothing about, they reached toward me again as if time had frozen instead of passed. Their sudden urgency clashed with the peace I had worked so hard to secure. By evening, the messages had begun to shift in tone. The earlier ones carried edge and insistence, but the later ones grew more fractured, almost unstable. I could sense the unraveling behind every word they typed. Something serious was happening on their end, something they couldn't contain or ignore. My sister's name appeared more frequently in the previews, her unraveling threaded through each paragraph. I didn't open her messages either, but I recognized the rhythm of her panic. Her life had always been built on assumptions of support, and now that foundation must have finally cracked. The weight of their turmoil pressed against me from a distance, not because I felt responsible, but because I could feel the echo of the person I used to be. The one who would have reacted instantly, who would have doubted her own boundaries, who would have rushed in to fix everything just to quiet the noise. That version of myself no longer existed, but I could still sense the outline of her in moments like this. As I silenced the notifications, a steadier thought rose to the surface. Whatever chaos had erupted in their home, it no longer belonged to me. The life I was building wasn't an escape. It was a separation born from clarity. Their crisis did not erase the years that led to my leaving, nor did it obligate me to return to the place where I had lost myself. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it was a deliberate boundary, one I wasn't willing to dismantle simply because they now found themselves facing consequences they once believed would never reach them. There is a certain stillness that settles in when you finally understand that the past no longer has authority over your life. It's not a loud realization. It arrives quietly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether you are ready to carry it. That stillness met me one afternoon as I returned to my apartment, expecting nothing more than a moment of rest before getting back to work. Instead, the air in the hallway felt tight, as though something unwanted had been waiting for me. I saw them before they noticed I was there. 3 familiar figures standing outside my door, their posture heavy with exhaustion and confusion. The sight didn't startle me the way it might have months earlier. It simply confirmed what their messages had been hinting at. They had reached the point where distance could no longer soften the reality they were facing. My parents looked worn out, their clothes wrinkled in a way that spoke of hurried decisions and long hours spent searching for answers they couldn't find. Amber stood slightly behind them, her expression clouded with the same panic I had sensed in her messages, though now it was stripped of the confidence she once carried. For a moment, I simply stood there, unnoticed, absorbing the scene. I felt the faint echo of old instincts, the urge to shrink, to avoid the confrontation, to prepare myself for whatever version of blame or chaos might spill into the space. But the instinct faded as quickly as it appeared. The person who had learned to brace herself for their storms no longer existed in the way they expected. When they finally saw me, a wave of recognition passed through them. Their shoulders straightened in a way that held hope, expectation, and a kind of desperation they had never shown in my direction before. Yet none of it rooted itself in me. The hallway felt like neutral ground, a place where their urgency no longer had power over my choices. I didn't move closer. I didn't open the door. I didn't offer comfort. Instead, I let the silence stretch long enough to make it clear that whatever they were searching for, they would not find it in me. Their presence there, uninvited and unannounced, was not a plea I had to answer. It was a consequence of years they had constructed without ever considering where their decisions would lead. Their faces shifted as they realized I wasn't stepping forward, wasn't softening, wasn't preparing to take on the role they had assigned me all my life. I could see questions forming, excuses rising, but none of it reached me. I didn't need to hear explanations. I didn't need to process their regret. Their crisis belonged to them, not to the person they once treated as disposable. Without saying a word, I stepped past them, unlocked my door, and created a boundary they could not cross. I closed it firmly, not in anger but in finality. On the other side, I could hear their confusion, the faint shuffle of feet, the quiet collapse of whatever hope had carried them there. They stayed for a few minutes, then their presence faded down the hallway until the building settled back into silence. Inside my apartment, I felt no triumph and no guilt, only clarity. Their lives had begun to unravel, not because I left, but because the foundation they had built was already unstable. My absence did not ruin them. It merely revealed the fractures they had ignored for years. The reality they faced was a reflection of their choices, not mine. Standing in the quiet, I understood something important. Letting go was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-respect. For years, I had been taught that loyalty meant endurance, even when it hurt. But distance had shown me that real loyalty begins with yourself. You cannot fix people who refuse to see their own patterns. You cannot save those who expect you to sacrifice your well-being for their comfort. And you cannot build a peaceful life while clinging to relationships that only know how to take. If there is anything I carry forward from all of this, it is the knowledge that walking away is sometimes the most honest form of healing. Not every story finds closure in reconciliation. Some stories close with distance, clarity, and the quiet understanding that you deserve a life shaped by your own choices, not by the expectations of those who never saw your worth until they needed something from you.